Okay. So they would do this experiment where they would tie this larvae. They call this ligation. So they would tie a little knot. And this prevents materials from flowing from one side to the other. Okay. So it essentially separates the head from the butt. Okay. And what they discovered is when they did this, shit, I forgot my tea. Fuck. I am John Beckmann, Professor John Beckmann, Dr. John Beckmann, the father of the transgenic mother of sin, your hostess with the mostest. Get a green screen in the back, half my brain tied behind my back just to make it fair. All right. I saw some crazy shit online that, again, like, I need to react to this because it's fresh in the news and it relates to my entomological expertise. So I saw some strange clip where bodybuilders were taking ecdysone, an insect hormone, the insect molting hormone. So I need to relook at these and get my reaction recorded to this because I thought it was crazy. Where I saw this was with Joe Rogan, Huberman, Hubba Hubba. I like Dr. Hubba Hubba because in a world today where people are trying to feminize all men and trying to demasculinate men, I like the idea that there's a Stanford professor talking about how to enhance, boost, and amplify testosterone. So I have to say, I have a fond affinity for Dr. Hubba Hubba. And I'll
The
grab
Joe
my
Rogan
tea
experience.
The hormone augmentation thing is always a little bit of a complicated discussion, but there's so much that's happening there right now that's really interesting.
Like what?
Right, so if you think about, I'll probably pick an example where you'll know the exception because I know you know a lot about natural animals and animals that are hunted. But if you think about animals with antlers, like rams, there's been a lot of research, believe it or not, on rams. It'd be fun. I'd love to work on
rams have enormous balls.
And they have to fight for the right to mate.
Yes.
And the fighting is a choice, right? And the decision to walk away is a choice usually. They usually don't kill each
All right, here's where Hubba Hubba is talking about testosterone.
There are incredible plant compounds out there. Like there's this thing that's now kind of going wild on the internet. I've never tried it, but it's called turkesterone.
Turkesterone.
Yeah, they call it Turk and this is basically it. And I actually I did one episode of my podcast all about hormones, and I went deep into this literature, and turkesterone side by side with Deca or another testosterone derivative, it essentially acts the same way. It increases testosterone and performance and recovery. You know,
how much does it increase it by?
Equivalent.
Really?
So
this plant compound is equivalent to Deca?
Essentially.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where do you get this stuff?
People buy it on the internet.
How do you spell it?
Now, on a milligram to milligram basis, right? So comparing dose per dose, look at how much more powerful ecdysterone is compared to the testosterone group. And
what is the y-axis?
Which is not.
Oh, it's okay. So the y-axis is bench gains per dose, milligrams of ecdysterone versus testosterone. And they're saying if bodybuilders take insect molting hormone, it doubles their bench press gains.
Natural, by the way, is more anabolic and more powerful than testosterone. Well, let's find out. Now, again, this is another episode of Testosterone Thursday. Today's Thursday, so obviously we're discussing testosterone as usual. And lately, I've been bombarded with questions on ecdysterone and turkesterone.
I gotta write this shit down.
This is what we're analyzing. So I'm picking two different studies here, right? So we're picking the famous classic study from Beckmann in '96, where he's pretty much comparing the effect of testosterone.
Eisenman 2019. Let's see if we can find this. PubMed. Okay, this is 2019. Archives of Toxicology. Ecdysteroids as non-conventional anabolic agent. Performance enhancement by ecdysterone supplements in humans. Study from Berlin, Germany. The Germans pumping insect hormones. Let me just quickly look through this abstract. Significantly higher increases in muscle mass were observed in those participants that were dosed with ecdysterone. They're claiming that this happens by ecdysterone binding the estrogen receptor. Let me see if I can look at the figures. Let's look at the figures. All right, here's the figures. Y-axis, body weight and muscle mass. All right, so let's look at the figure. Okay, PL is placebo, ecdysone 1, ecdysone 2 are people taking the ecdysone. Control group is on the right, CO. Control group, they've taken just 2 pills. So it's just kind of like, here's if you take a whole bunch in a consistent basis, here's if you just take 2 pills. So the placebo and the control are way below. I mean, you could debate that with error bars, but it's statistically significant, again, especially against the control group. So it looks like it's definitely increasing body weight. And it looks like a big effect on muscle mass as well, statistically significant. So you get an extra 2 kilograms of muscle mass if you're pumping with insect molting hormone. This is so bizarre. This is the product they're taking, peak ecdysone. Shit, you can just buy this shit. You can just buy insect molting hormone. You can just buy it online. 33 euros. Holy shit. You can buy some. Here's some Asian ecdysone. What? On Amazon. Okay, this is crazy. By the way, my bro here is moreplatesmoredates.com. I think his channel is pretty interesting. He talks a lot of human physiology too. It's an interesting channel. All right, I've seen enough. I mean, my role here should be to explain ecdysterone's context in the insect part, right? All right, I pulled out my old insect physiology textbook to get a quick refresher on this. Hopefully this will help. So let me discuss the role of ecdysone in insects and with respect to entomology. Okay, so the compounds that these bodybuilders are talking about are terkesterone and ecdysone, okay? Ecdysone has a bunch of different names. You can see it as in the literature as ecdysterone, ecdysone, 20-hydroxyecdysone, and there's also a bunch of different kind of like variants and metabolite, I guess like side products of ecdysone. So there's various names for it. The other thing that the bodybuilders are talking about is terkesterone. Okay, so let's just quick define these. Ecdysone is the molting hormone. So in insects, in entomology, when an insect molts, that means it has grown to the point where its exoskeleton is now a limiting factor on its growth. It cannot grow further beyond its exoskeleton because the exoskeleton is hard. It's like having the bones outside of your body. So in order for it to escape this limitation and to grow larger, insects have to molt. So they have to shed their exoskeleton, their exocuticle, and get rid of that. And then they go through a phase where they can grow now to a different size, a larger size. Okay. So ecdysis actually means shedding of the outer skin. That's actually what it means. So when you hear ecdysis, that's when insects molt. And each insect has a various amount of molts, definitely usually more than 1 and usually more than 3. So typically insects, holometabolous insects go through three phases if you're talking about classical metamorphosis. So right, if you know about insects, there's usually an egg stage, and then there's usually kind of like a little thing that like crawls and eats, which is the larvae. And then there are typically various phases of larvae. So there's different molts during the larvae, and we call these instars. Or if you're talking about hemimetabolous insects, we're talking about nymphs, different nymphal stages. Okay. So typically there might be 1, 2, and 3 larval stages where each larvae is progressively larger than the one before. And each of these transition from one to the next requires a molt. So this would be molt 1. This would be molt 2. This would be molt 3. And then there is a molt in holometabolous insects to become a pupae. Okay, so pupae is when the metamorphosis is actually happening, when you're changing from this crawling eating machine to typically an adult insect that flies and mates. Okay, that's pupation. So this would be like a molt 4. Okay, and then we all know the butterfly emerges from the cocoon, or typically the flying imago, the adult, emerges from the pupae. So we're talking about a fly, a dipteran. You'll have something that looks like this come out. And that's sort of like let's see. Okay, so I should actually describe this. This is molt 1. This is molt 2. This is molt 3. And molt 4 is pupae to the adult. Okay. So there are, typically at least like 4 and maybe more molts, depending on the insect that you're looking at. And ecdysone regulates each of these processes when it happens in the insect. Okay. All right, let's talk about the discovery of ecdysone. So there's a classical study using caliphorids. So caliphorids are shit flies, blowflies, metallic. Usually see them, they're metallic green, or they can be various colors. This is Caliphora vomitorius or something like that is the name. They grow in crap, but they're also like a great model. And these were a classical model for insect hormone studies. Okay, so what this study, Dr. Frankel in 1935, a person who was originally responsible for characterizing ecdysone activity, they would take these larvae. So they would take these larval stages, okay, and they would tie a little piece of floss or string around and tighten it, okay, in the middle of the larvae, okay? And in the larvae, you have an anterior side, which is like the head, and you have a posterior side, which is like the butt, okay? So they would do this experiment where they would tie this larvae. They call this ligation. So they would tie a little knot. And this prevents materials from flowing from one side to the other, okay? So it essentially separates the head from the butt, okay? And what they discovered is when they did this is in this experiment, as this tied creature grew, only the anterior side would pupate, okay? So if you imagine this like yellow shell is like a pupal casing, okay? When they would do this, the anterior side would pupate, but the posterior side would like remain as a larval form, okay? So what they discovered here, the conclusion here is a couple things. One, there's some substance that's controlling pupation. So a substance controls pupation. The second conclusion here is that whatever is producing the substance is in the head. Okay. And they were actually able to prove that the substance that was controlling this activity was ecdysone. And the way that they prove this is a modification of this experiment. So they do the same thing, okay, before a critical period in the larvae. They tie the larvae off with anterior and posterior ends separated, okay? And we know that the anterior end is going to pupate. But this time what they do is they inject with a little syringe or a needle ecdysone. Ecdysone. Spell it properly. They inject ecdysone into the posterior end, okay? And when they do that, now both sides of the tied off creature pupate, okay? So they can, another word for this in science is complementation, or perhaps you might call this rescuing, okay, rescuing some particular phenotype. They're able to complement this lack of ability to pupate in the posterior end by injecting ecdysone, which proves that ecdysone is sufficient. That's all you need for pupation, or if you wanted to think more generally, for molting. Okay, so this is one of the earliest, most significant studies in 1935 done to figure out that ecdysone is central in controlling molting of various stages of the insect. It's a very cool study. Okay, and let's talk about sort of like the classical model of how ecdysone is stimulated and how it works. So the classical model is if you have like an insect larvae, let's say like this is a larvae, looks something like this. Up here is anterior, so this is the head. Down here is posterior. Okay, insects have a brain, okay? And the classical model is that when a molt is about to happen, okay, usually, again, the larvae is an eating machine. So the larvae will go around and it'll just collect nutrients, resources, and it will eat. And as it eats, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And its gut will stretch and stretch and stretch. This is similar for a mosquito. When a mosquito takes a blood meal, its gut will like stretch, okay? And that stretching activity often stimulates hormonal signaling, okay? So the stretch receptors can activate pieces of the brain, and then the brain then releases a chemical called PTTH, prothoracicotropic hormone, okay? So this is a peptide hormone, and its job is to stimulate the prothoracic gland. So the prothoracic gland is a gland, these things. There are two glands in the anterior side of the larvae near the head, and their job is to make ecdysone. So once they get a bolus of prothoracicotropic hormone, the prothoracic glands then make ecdysone. I always spell it with a Z, but it's not spelled with a Z, it's spelled with an S. They make ecdysone and then they release it, which causes the molt, okay? So this is the classical model for how ecdysone is stimulated in the insect and how it's released. Now let's look at the molts and the actual levels of ecdysone, because there's a classical model, again, of how ecdysone is controlling molting in insects. So I apologize, this is a little bit blurry. But one thing that's really interesting about the molting hormone is that the molting hormone controls all these different molts. So if you remember back, all these different molts, okay, larvae, different larval instars, conversion of larvae to pupae, conversion of pupae to adult, all those are stimulated by ecdysone. So they're vastly kind of different things, but they're all conserved in the sense that they're stimulated by ecdysone, which is really interesting. And the way that you might ask the question, well, how does the insect know? How does the insect know if it's just ecdysone that's controlling it? How does the insect know whether it's supposed to go from instar to instar or instar to pupae or pupae to adult? How does it actually know that? Okay, so ecdysone is intricately connected with another hormone called juvenile hormone. Okay. And this is the classical model of the interaction between ecdysone and juvenile hormone. So in an insect, every time there's a spike of ecdysone, that induces a molt. Okay? And then there's like a conditional logic circuit where if juvenile hormone is present, the insect stays at a juvenile stage. So ecdysone peaks, induces a molt, and if juvenile hormone is high, so in this case, juvenile hormone is high, the insect will molt, but it will stay as a larvae. It'll stay at a juvenile stage, okay? And then at a certain point, when the insect is ready to go to the pupal form, the last juvenile molt, there's a period where ecdysone will peak, but juvenile hormone drops, okay? And if there's an ecdysone peak when juvenile hormone is low, that causes the insect to turn into a pupal form, okay? And then in the pupal form, it's the conversion to the adult stage. So the signal that causes an insect to change from juvenile form to a pupal form to adult is a spike in ecdysone, but a drop in juvenile hormone. Okay, so this is a classic thing, and you will encounter this on your entomological oral examinations all the time. This is like a favorite thing for physiology professors to ask. So you want to know this. And again, the thing to remember is that every molt is stimulated by a peak of ecdysone, and the controlling factor is juvenile hormone in terms of knowing which molt is taking place. So if juvenile hormone was this yellowish color, you would imagine to draw the juvenile hormone would look something like this. And then when the pupil molt spikes, juvenile hormone is low. Okay. And then this stimulates transition to the pupae. And then the next molts emerge as adults. Okay. So that's the function of ecdysone in an insect. Now, another really interesting thing is this compound turkesterone, which people are apparently taking as bodybuilders. Okay, turkesterone is an analog of ecdysone. So if you look at the chemicals, here's turkesterone, here's ecdysone. Let's see if we can find their difference. It looks like here, in this one, there's an OH. There's an alcohol in turkesterone, and in here, and in ecdysone, there's nothing there. It looks like that's the main difference. And what this is an analog from plants. So this is fascinating, that the idea that plants are actually making mimics of insect hormones, with the idea being plants need to defend themselves against insect herbivory. Okay. And if they're producing analogs of insect hormones and the insects eat them, this is going to mess with the endocrine systems of the insect. Okay. So these are defensive chemicals that modulate, in theory, insect molting and can cause problems. All right. That's it. So that's all you need to know about ecdysone. But I think it's great. Like, it's crazy to me that it's just fascinating to me that people are eating ecdysone or turkesterone as mammals to peak bodybuilding activity. It's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is, right, like people are talking about eating insects because they have superior protein content. One thing that would be interesting to look into is which stage of crickets have maximum 20-hydroxyecdysone. Like if it's the, you would want to essentially synchronize your growth of crickets, okay? And then like liquid nitrogen freeze them at a peak point where their hydroxyecdysone is at a peak. And then you would want to like grind them up in liquid nitrogen, store that in the freezer, and then eat it as powder. And then you would get both protein and 20-hydroxyecdysone stimulation for your bodybuilding activities. That would be a really interesting way to see if you could do some natural supplementation by eating mounds and mounds of cricket juice. Okay, have a good day.